You're now watching Around the Horn, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is June 4th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horn, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website, and is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horn.
Thank you for inviting me.
Horne, as we go around the horn. First, we'll want to ask you about the news from June 1st that the Ukraine smuggled hundreds of drones into Russia to launch a series of major strikes on at least 40 Russian warplanes at 4 military bases. This was Ukraine's biggest long-range attack of the war with Russia, which some have referred to as, quote, Russia's Pearl Harbor, striking 34% of Russia's strategic cruise missile carriers. The attacks come as Russian and Ukrainian negotiators headed to Istanbul for a second round of peace talks on Monday, June 2nd. The Ukrainian and Russian delegations concluded peace talks in Istanbul, and while they agreed on a new prisoner exchange, they once again failed to reach any sort of ceasefire agreement. And yesterday, Tuesday, June 3rd, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth urged allies to raise defense spending and warned that China may pose an imminent military threat in a landmark speech on the Trump administration's approach to Asia. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction and analysis of all of this news? And is it an overreaction that this recent news seems like even more steps towards war?
Well, I'm afraid that that is a correct perception. I think that in the past few days, this small planet has taken concrete steps towards World War III. More to the point, U.S. imperialism has taken concrete steps towards World War III. Let me point the audience to a revealing interview with President Lula of Brazil in the French publication Le Monde, where he recounts and reports how during a lengthy meeting with former U.S. President Joseph R. Biden, the U.S. president suggested that his mission was to, quote, destroy, unquote, Russia. And I think that that animating spirit has yet to dissipate, even though, as we shall discuss shortly, there are contradictions within the U.S. ruling class as to the feasibility and indeed the viability of that particular stratagem. I should also point out or reiterate what has already been said, which is that the Ukrainians, apparently with the assistance of their European allies, likely Great Britain, likely Germany, and probably the United States of America, attack the strategic bombing force of Russia. Now, these planes are on the tarmac, as you see, because that was the mandate of the so-called START Treaty, which allows U.S. satellites to photograph and spy on these planes from outer space. And one has to wonder, besides spectacle, what was the interest of Ukraine in attacking strategic bombers designed to deliver a nuclear payload, most likely in the nightmare scenario, to London or Washington? What was the interest of Ukraine in pursuing this particular approach? And I think we should also not forget that in the last week or two, there was an attempt to assassinate President Putin. His helicopter was fired on as he was landing, or as it was in the vicinity of Kursk, the Russian site where supposedly the Ukrainians had invaded some months ago and they had been repelled. And we should also point out this New York Times story from a few weeks ago, which went into great detail talking about U.S. intelligence assistance to the Ukrainians And this also opens the door, if the Russians are going to be responding, and that is the import of the conversation today on the telephone between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, where Mr. Putin pledged that there would be some sort of retaliation. I take it that the retaliation will be against Ukraine, but in some sense, it would not be inappropriate for the Russians to attack a similar U.S. base in, say, North Dakota, given the fact that they have reason to believe that a U.S. proxy, speaking of Ukraine, struck deep within Russian soil. Now, this is the point that I foreshadowed a few moments ago. There's no doubt that there is a split in the U.S. ruling class with regard to this dangerous approach against Russia. Indeed, Steve Bannon, the erstwhile counselor and advisor to Mr. Trump, has suggested that Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina should be imprisoned. And you may recall that Senator Graham was in Kiev just before this attack on Sunday against Russia. And the import of Steve Bannon's comment is that he thinks that Lindsey Graham is playing with fire. But the fundamental split in the U.S. ruling class is between and amongst those who think that in order to get at China, that there should be a weakening of China's ally, Russia. Others think that in order to get at China, that there should be a deal cut with Russia. And there are those who had thought that Mr. Trump was in that camp, but you may have noticed a shift in his rhetoric in recent days, referring to a, quote, crazy, unquote, Mr. Putin, suggesting that it was actually Putin who was playing with fire. And so it's unclear where Mr. Trump stands, and perhaps that's part of his approach, just like his approach with China, a la Nixon, is to appear to be crazy, and he doesn't have to do that much acting to put forward that kind of visage. And likewise, perhaps it fits his stratagem to have these divergent camps within the ruling cabal in Washington, which I take it he feels gives him more latitude. For example, obviously, Mr. Putin took his call today. Apparently, that suggests that Mr. Putin still feels that it is worthwhile to work with Mr. Trump. And which brings us, of course, to the inflammatory, incendiary speech by Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth in Singapore at the so-called Shangri-La Forum. The problem for U.S. imperialism right now is that if there is to be an attack on China, particularly over Taiwan, there will have to be buy-in, I would imagine, from the Philippines. The problem is that their placeman in Manila, speaking of President Marcos Jr., or Bong Bong, to use his nickname, will be stepping down in the next year or two. And his possible, if not probable, replacement, Sara Duterte, is the daughter of former President Duterte, now, as you know, in The Hague, which is another stitch-up that's worthy of comment. And it's suspected that the Dutertes, or at least Sara Duterte, would emulate her father in terms of taking a soft line against China, which would be consistent with the notion that many elites in Manila are rather friendly, shall we say, with the Chinese Filipino elite, which plays a prominent role in the economy and is not necessarily in tune or on board with regard to an attack on the People's Republic of China. I think that we have to ask ourselves, at the end of the day, in order to destabilize Russia and China, will U.S. imperialism run the risk of blowing up the world? And I think the short answer is yes. That is to say, there are those in the audience who are probably familiar with that old-time story about the character who burns down the house to roast the pig. You see that particular lunatic strategy in play already in the United States, where Mr. Trump and his Department of Education are threatening to destabilize Harvard, Columbia, of course, now having its accreditation threatened, despite their major contributions to the U.S. ruling class over the decades, if not the centuries, because they feel that this will appeal to a sector of their base, which supposedly is anti-elite, and obviously the Ivy League is at the apex of the elite. We see this lunatic strategy as well with regard to Mr. Trump's approach to Apple, which has been threatened, despite the fact that it's a multi-trillion-dollar company, being threatened unless it moves production back to the United States of America, which could raise the price of an iPhone over $3,000 and could severely wound Apple's stock price. And so Mr. Trump is also threatening major corporations as well, in addition to Ivy League universities, and it's reminiscent of the ill-fated, ill-considered war in Vietnam, concluding in 1975, 50 years ago, when at a certain point, certain troops on the U.S. side said that they had to burn down the village in order to save it. Now, I know that that makes no sense, but that seems to be the strategy of lunacy within the highest ranks of U.S. imperialism. You see this in the BBB legislation, the beautiful big bill, the big beautiful bill, where the Republicans in Congress are threatening to wreck the economy in order to give tax breaks to billionaires. And so the wider way to look at what's happening right now with regard to the U.S. ruling class, in particular the Trump wing, is that these sorts of approaches, threatening to blow up the world, threatening Ivy League universities, threatening multi-trillion-dollar corporations, threatening to wreck the economy, it's a reflection of imperialism in decline. It's a reflection of the irrationality of imperialism in decline. The problem, from our point of view, is that we're on this ship of fools headed towards an iceberg. And unless we're able to grab the wheel that's manipulating this vessel, we too will be destroyed in the process.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the Congo. In April, we reported on the fact that former Congolese President Joseph Kabila returned to Congo from self-imposed exile, arriving in rebel-held Goma City. We also reported on the fact that the prominent Trump supporter Erik Prince and founder of Blackwater reached a deal with Democratic Republic of Congo to secure its mines and exploit Congo's vast mineral wealth. Dr. Horne, what is the last news from the Congo that we should be aware of? And what role have Joseph Kabila and Erik Prince played since we last discussed the Congo in April?
Well, just to recapitulate, Joseph Kabila, you may recall, is a former leader of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, had to step down or chose to step down, and has spending a good deal of his time of late in South Africa, deciding to return to his homeland in recent days and weeks. The peers of Mr. Kabila, that is to say, fellow legislators and fellow political leaders in Kinshasa, the capital, have decided that he is worthy of being put on trial for treason. This is in light of the fact that he's being accused of consorting with the so-called M23 rebels in eastern Congo, who in turn are accused of being supported by neighboring Rwanda, with the point that brings them into coalition being looting the Congo of its vast mineral wealth. At the same time, a neighboring Uganda is charged with providing support to the regime. And so, at least on the surface, this puts Rwanda and Uganda at odds. This recalls what happened in the Congo in the late 1990s, when you had a number of African nations, including Zimbabwe, involved in its internal affairs in terms of fighting on the ground. I dare say that the involvement of Zimbabwe's military probably helped to weaken the regime of then President Robert Mugabe, which led a decade or so later to his being dislodged in an internal palace coup, bringing to power the current leader, Emerson Mnangagwa, and to provide wider context with regard to Congo, which is an important nation strategically in Africa, given its vastness. It's about the size of Western Europe in terms of territory. However, it suffered grievously at the hands of the Belgians. Recall that in the late 19th century, King Leopold in Brussels claimed the Congo as his personal fiefdom. At the time of independence, circa 1960, 1961, there were hardly any trained cadre in that vast country in terms of doctors or engineers, medics, and the like. And in that context, Patrice Lumumba surged to power. Recall, I believe we discussed the recent documentary, which we've recommended, that is to say, Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat, which, among other things, deals with the assassination of Lumumba, deals with the role of Black Americans in the Congo. Recall that Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief, confessed in a memoir that the agency was complicit in the assassination of Mr. Lumumba, which led to decades of misrule by the kleptocrat, once known as Joseph Mobutu, who in many ways was a creature of the anti-communism of the Cold War, a banner that he held aloft. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, that pulled the rug out from under his regime, leading to the rise of Mr. Kabila's father, Laurent Kabila, and then Joseph Kabila himself. In any case, we also understand that in addition to Erik Prince, there has been talk in Washington, at least, of a sort of minerals for security deal. That is to say that in return for getting a stranglehold on the vast mineral wealth of the Congo, the U.S. administration would either dispatch the mercenaries of Erik Prince or dispatch, indeed, U.S. military forces, not unlike the kind of deal that has just been struck with the Ukraine, a sort of minerals for security deal. This is the sort of banditry that U.S. imperialism is now engaged in as it arrives in its death throes. And certainly we need a revival of the African solidarity movement, which was so instrumental and pivotal in helping to bring down apartheid circa 1994, but certainly needs to be brought back, but at a higher level.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn. This discussion of U.S. and Wall Street imperialism and Erik Prince also leads us to Haiti. It was reported on May 29th that Haitian-American military veterans are actively being recruited by Erik Prince of Blackwater to serve as paid mercenaries in Haiti. Dr. Horne, what is the latest news our audience should be aware of regarding Haiti? And how would you describe the role of Erik Prince and Blackwater? And how terrified should we be of what Prince and Blackwater are up to around the world?
Well, obviously, it's of grave and monumental concern. And obviously, as well, there's a sort of through line here in terms of Erik Prince and his mercenaries exploiting Black people, be they in the Congo or be they in Haiti. Listeners and viewers may recall that it was not so long ago that Kenyan police forces were sent to this Caribbean island in order to corral what have been described as gangs who, it is said, are running amok and running rampant in Haiti. But alas, apparently the Kenyan police forces have not been able to fulfill their mandate. And in any event, the regime of William Ruto back in Nairobi is under very severe pressure right now because Mr. Ruto, as we reported on this program, has been a frequent visitor to the People's Republic of China. And China has increasing interest in Kenya, which has outraged and incensed Washington, which probably helps to explain as well why Mr. Ruto has just cut a deal with the favorite African puppet, speaking of Morocco, to recognize Morocco's illicit land grab of the Western Sahara, which is yearning for independence and in turn is supported by Algeria. As well, the Caribbean neighbors of Haiti are on a tightrope because on the one hand, once again, as we've reported, Many of their foreign ministers and leaders had just come back from China with bags of goodies of various sorts, which once again has outraged Washington. And so they're being pressured as well to support this sort of interference in Haiti, lest they become victimized by U.S. imperialism itself. And so I'm old enough to recall when there was an organization in Washington called Trans-Africa, which focused on issues of concern to the African diaspora in particular, not least Southern Africa, not least the Caribbean. Since Trans-Africa closed up shop, there's been a gaping absence in terms of legislative pressure and political pressure in Washington. Certainly the better part of wisdom would be to revive once again that kind of lobbying effort, but once again on a higher level.
Horne, as we go around the Horn. This discussion of the role of Erik Prince and Blackwater seems to perhaps lead us into rethinking our Lumpin analysis. In terms of developing a Lumpin analysis, how do the events we just discussed in Haiti, the news that El Salvador's President Bukele backstabbed his now former allies in M13, as well as Mexico and its contradictions with the so-called cartels, as well as the federal criminal cases against Sean Puffy Combs and Gene Henley, or even the news that Trump pardoned Larry Hoover, and there is a seemingly endless list of such examples. But Dr. Horne, how does all of this fit into the development of a more rigorous analysis of the Lumpin?
Well, we raised this issue in part because recall that in my book published last year, Armed Struggle, it deals with the Panthers, who were an important political organization trying to build a bridge between Black nationalism and socialism. I argued that because of their disappointment with what they perceived to be the weaknesses ideologically, politically, and otherwise of the settler descendant working class, that in search for a replacement for that particular sector as a locomotive to propel change, they gravitated towards the idea of the Lumpin. Now, to be fair, I would think that the Panthers, when they were talking about a Lumpin analysis and its role in the revolutionary process, they were not necessarily thinking of the big Lumpin, which is what we've just recounted here. That is to say, those who in many ways are part of the 1%. For example, Mr. Bukele of El Salvador and the deals that he cut with the so-called M13 to get into office before stabbing the M13 in the back, not to mention some of these figures that are now flashing across the screen who have enjoyed tremendous wealth. I think, to be fair to the Panthers, they were not necessarily thinking of the big Lumpin, although they were not necessarily clear when articulating this strategy. They were thinking of the small fry Lumpin, the sort of Lumpin that is involved in stripping automobiles or selling nickel bags on the corner and that sort of thing. But in any case, what we need to recognize is this, is the recrudescence of the Lumpin, which has just been articulated concerning El Salvador and Mexico. Does that represent a decline of imperialism, or does it signal or supplement a new stratum that will be supporting imperialism as it goes into its terminal decline? In any case, these are the sorts of questions of social science that we need a deeper analysis of. And of course, on the screen, you see one of my attempts at providing a deeper analysis that's in the book, I Dare Say. That is to say, that article, Rethinking the Lumpin, which in many ways recounts some of the points that I've made here. And I should also mention in this context that the Lumpin has played an instrumental role in terms of the evolution of U.S. capitalism. You cannot separate the roots of the African slave trade from the Lumpin of centuries previous. You cannot understand indigenous dispossession or indeed settler colonialism without understanding the instrumental role of cutthroats and thugs in terms of being in the vanguard. And once again, to turn to the big lumpin, some of you may know that the ancestors of former US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt were deeply enmeshed in the opium sale and trade to China in the mid-19th century. In fact, that kind of drug trade and that kind of lumpin activity has been an essential part of what used to be called the primitive accumulation of capital. So I think at the end of the day, we need to recognize that the lumpin can be useful occasionally with regard to revolutionary struggle, particularly if one is on the verge of seizing power and one needs to enlist those who have praxis with regard to asymmetric tactics, for example, or hard-headed tactics for that matter. And given their working class roots, particularly the small lumpin can play that role. But in the larger scheme of things, in terms of a long-term analysis, I think for those who are looking for a way to do an end run around the frequent backwardness of the settler descendant working class, to take a hint from our ancestors, let us say that the ancestors of we of African descent, and lengthen the battlefield. That is to say, enlist healthy forces on a global scale, which once again leads me to reiterate the importance of the African Union Caribbean Community Summit, CARICOM Summit, September 2025 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That would be a wonderful opportunity to lengthen the battlefield for our benefit.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also wanted to ask you about the news from May 30th that the U.S. Supreme Court granted the Trump administration's request to stay a district court order in Svetlana Doe versus Noam, stripping the legal status and work permits of an estimated 500,000 people en masse who came to the U.S. through the humanitarian parole processes for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. The Trump administration asked the Supreme Court to take extraordinary action to block the district court's preliminary injunction even before the First Circuit heard the case on appeal. The news comes after the Supreme Court issued a similar order in Noam versus National TPS Alliance, revoking temporary protected status from an estimated 350,000 Venezuelans. Dr. Horne, how alarming is this news?
Extremely alarming. But once again, it opens the door for an opportunity. The Nicaraguans, the Cubans, the Haitians, for example, are heavily concentrated in South Florida. This opens the door for our side to turn the tables on the right wing, because certainly with regard to the Venezuelan Americans, the Cuban Americans, and to a degree the Nicaraguan Americans, many of them were on side with regard to MAGA, with regard to the Trump forces. Obviously, they're very angry and furious right now. We need to turn that anger and fury into political capital. And I should say it's even more important because Canada has already decided that it will not provide a sanctuary for those fleeing the United States of America. For Haitians, this presents a real dilemma in terms of being forced to return to their homeland, which, as noted, is undergoing major stress right now. And certainly, unless we're careful, there will be even further roundups. We've looked with dismay at these detentions of students in Georgia and in Massachusetts, roundups in San Diego and Colorado. So once again, I think the message to our side is clear and evident. We need to be organizing. We need to be marching. We need to be protesting. We need to be supporting the community of undocumented workers. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.